At the start of the year, I talked about how I wanted to explore strategy in more abstract ways than I had in the first several months of the show. And it's for this reason why I was so keen to talk to Erez Yoeli. With Moshe Hoffman, he's the co-author of Hidden Games, in which they argue that game theory underpins our societies. As I say to Erez, I've always been interested in game theory, but only ever had a vague grasp on it. On today's episode, Erez and I discuss why game theory is more varied than the Cold War stereotype, the way that it is essential for things like trust and cooperation in society, and also I explain how Real Housewives helped me understand it. We also touch on wine tasting, Batman, and if game theory can explain Donald Trump's seemingly irrational behaviour these last several weeks. I really hope you enjoy the show. Erez, thank you very much for being a guest on the show.
My pleasure entirely.
I always start with my Inside the Actors Studio questionnaire, or Proustian, if I want to seem intellectual. What is your favourite word?
It's a favorite word, maybe like noodle.
Nice.
I like words that sound like the thing that they are. It's just fun.
Like onomatopoeia kind of.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Wow, noodle, hot versus cold. I love that in language and that it appears everywhere.
Someone I interviewed the other day, she said her favourite word was sequoia for the same reason. It just had a sort of, gave her a feeling. What is your least favourite word?
I think like others, I mean, this is related, but like others often say that they don't like words like moist or damp or things like that because they kind of automatically trigger the reaction to the actual thing that is being described. And yeah, some of those words actually like kind of feel man when you say them.
What is your favorite curse word?
Oh, I'm from New York. I grew up outside of New York and we say fuck a lot. I mean, just a lot. For us, it's a word of emphasis. And I really had to train myself out of using it that way because in other places it's considered rude. But in New York, it's just like how you emphasize things.
Has any of your research on game theory prompted you to use it?
To use it? No, I believe that I have managed to avoid using the F word in my research. I don't think I've used shit, but I never fuck.
What is a sound or noise that you love?
Oh, I grew up playing percussion. I love lots of percussion instruments, just like make me super excited. And then also because you spend a lot of time in the back of the orchestra, the brass instruments too, like especially like a trombone. Ooh, it's so beautiful.
What is a sound or noise that you hate?
Metal on metal. Like take a fork and a knife and scrape them together, and I want to leave the room.
Do you have any guilty pleasures?
Guilty pleasures. I would say, yeah, finishing the macaroni and cheese that I made for my 2-year-old.
Nice.
I quote unquote made for my 2-year-old.
What is your favorite book?
It's a book that I think a lot about regularly and that I love the way it was written is The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. As somebody who I would really aspire to write like.
Finally, is there a fictional character who you like to imagine yourself to be?
There's something very compelling about Batman. He's very ethical. He's like doing good in the world, but he's outside of like the bureaucracy and the system. And you know, it'd be nice to be Batman. You know, being a billionaire is not bad too.
I mean, that's kind of interesting because so literally the second season of this show kicked off with a discussion about James Bond and strategy. And me and my guest contrast James Bond, who's rooted in a bureaucracy, and Batman, who is outside of a bureaucracy, and how it's a strange sort of contrast in the superhero model.
Yeah. Batman seems to really lean into the being outside the system thing, and there's something that I think a lot of people like to fantasize about being outside the system in various different ways, and that is part of why Batman is so compelling. And then at the same time, despite being outside the system, he manages to retain these sort of very strong ethical boundaries on himself, which requires self-control, and we all view as being worthy of emulation. And so he's a fun character.
So I've always been fascinated by economics, game theory, but I never really felt smart enough to study them. I'm a history guy. So I'm curious about what drew you to them.
It was, like many things, chance. So I did not start out in economics doing game theory. I didn't even start out in economics. I started out as a musician. I mentioned earlier I grew up playing percussion. When I left music, I entered into undergrad with the expectation that I would be an engineer because that's what my dad was, and that's what people who want, to have a good job study, right? And I figured that it was smart on the side to take econ classes because it would prepare me for the business world. I had no idea what economics was. I mean, you can tell for anyone who has studied economics at an undergraduate level, you already know that, like, oh wow, this guy really had no clue what economics, because they start you out with like micro and macro, and you're like, what the heck does this have to do with business? It's fairly remote, but I really liked it. I remember I had this teacher for Econ 1. He was at Columbia at the time. I was taking classes on a paper credit basis as I was transferring out of music school. His name was Matt Kahn. He today is a professor at USC. He's an urban economist. But he was just teaching us like Econ 1 out of an Econ 1 textbook. And I was riveted. I read the textbook from cover to cover within a week of it having been assigned to us. And then I remember being super excited about every lecture. And I at the time told I think my dad, it's like, I've been asking these questions for a long time, like why do things work the way that they do? And econ has like simple answers to that. It just like kind of strips away all of the complexity in a good and a bad way, but in a way that allows you to get a answer um, about the forces at play that make some sense. For a historian, your skin's probably crawling at this, right? Because historians are all about adding the complexity back.
Well, I remember when I was like 17 or 18 or something, I bought an abridged edition of a 3-volume biography of John Maynard Keynes, and it was like 1,000 pages. And I started reading it, and I was finding it interesting, but most of the actual economic bits, my eyes just kind of glazed over, and the actual sort of diplomacy and sort of high political bits, I'd sort of re-engage. And then after maybe about 200 pages, I just kind of went off on something else. So that was my main experience of like economic education.
Yeah, there is a really meaningful difference in like the way in which econ approaches a question and fields like history approach a question, where in history, like oversimplifying is bad. Whereas in economics, figuring out the oversimplification that's useful is kind of that's the whole game. And so I like that part of econ. I felt it really. I felt it was useful, and that was my introduction to econ. And then when it came to game theory, I had this buddy, the guy who I ended up writing the book Hidden Games with, who would ask me lots of interesting questions. And he was interested in game theory because, or initially had read that book that I mentioned earlier, The Selfish Gene, which uses simple game theory to explain various fairly puzzling phenomena in biology. And he said, if you can use it the way that they did in The Selfish Gene, why can't we use it to understand our own puzzling psychology? There should be more of this. And he kept pushing us to do this together, even though I wasn't much of a game theorist, just because he was interested and kind of convinced that there was more there. And I just kind of went along and tried to be helpful. So, but it was fun and interesting.
I mean, I've always had like a vague idea of what game theory was, like a sort of vague knowledge of John Nash and von Neumann, vague idea of like the prisoner's dilemma. my sort of sense of it was kind of as we were discussing before we came on, sort of how best to operate against an opponent with imperfect information. That was like my vague sort of understanding of it. But I didn't realize until I read Hidden Games about how much more there was to sort of game theory. So I wondered if like you can just give an overview of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Why don't we start with an overview of what game theory is, and then I'll sort of slot the book into that. So game theory is it's a math toolkit. It can get real mathy real fast, but at a fundamental level, it's actually fairly simple. A game is a way of looking at situations where people are interdependent, where I do the best thing for me to do depends on what you do, and the best thing for you to do depends on what I do. And we don't really know how to solve that. And so there's this math toolkit that has risen to help us solve that kind of recursive problem. And games tend to have at least the following three elements. Like you said, they can get more complicated, but like in the game that the environments you were describing, they can get more complicated. But they can also be very simple. They tend to have players, which just defines like who's interacting. The players have certain actions they can take. We just have to define that for all the players, and then based on those actions, the players get payoffs. And the key thing that makes game theory is that the payoff that I get depends not only on what I do, but also on what the other players are doing. And so there's the interdependency. That's the thing that really makes game theory, as opposed to some other econ subfield. When it comes to using this toolkit, there are lots of natural applications. You can look at things like how countries interact and compete. So there's these like famous applications during the Cold War to things like brinksmanship. Um, or you can look at things like auctions, given, how others are bidding, how should you bid, given the rules of the auction, that's going to, and given how others are bidding, that's going to determine how you bid and vice versa. So, really productive application has been to auctions. There have been great applications to understand how firms interact in the marketplace. So basically all antitrust enforcement all around the world relies at a fundamental level on game theory models. But there have also been applications to fields like biology, understanding things like why peacocks have long tails, or why dogs pee on the fire hydrants, and things like that. And so that's a very different kind of application. The applications we were talking about before, you have smart people in the boardroom smoking guitar, cigars in a smoky room, figuring out how to, what to do, and thinking about what the other player is doing, stuff like that. And nobody thinks that's how a peacock ended up with a long tail. Clearly, something else is kind of driving the decision making there. You can kind of basically say, and the one for humans, you can think that they choose optimally, sort of. Maybe they're not perfect at it, but you can imagine them trying to optimize. For the peacock, something else has to be doing it. That process is something like evolution. What we did in Hidden Games, to finally answer your question, was to ask, can we look at some other processes other than people just sitting around deliberating, and other than biological evolution, that also optimize, and then figure out where they're going to make a game theory relevant. And so what that did was basically open up this new set of applications. We weren't the first people to look at these applications, but what we were trying to do is kind of collect all those applications into a single book, add some new ones. And they focus really on people's kind of puzzling psychology. Why do we have the sense of rights that we do, or altruism, or sense of aesthetics? Those are the kinds of questions that we would tackle.
I mean, the one aspect that I found really interesting about Hidden Games is the social interaction aspect, and sort of the things coming out of people interacting with each other. My definition of strategy is sort of it's trying to achieve your ambitions as stuff outside your control tries to stop you, and like that stuff goes beyond like direct competitors. It's everything from macro forces to like other people in society. And so what I found interesting sort of reading Hidden Games is it sort of seemed like ways in which people can try and compel that stuff to conform to your ambitions.
Some parts of it are, and some parts of it are just like things that we take for granted and think are just like the way things are, and then it's all about turning them on their head, making people realize, oh wait, it's kind of funny that we do that, and then trying to figure out why we do it. So like, why you don't just grab somebody's wallet or the money from their wallet on a day-to-day basis is, because they get mad at me. They'd be like, that's my money. And you don't really think about the fact that that's in fact rather strange. And so you have to do some work to make it strange, and then do some work to make people understand where it comes from. So some of the applications are more to that, and some of the applications are more of these kind of deliberate environments that you're describing.
There was a particular line I liked about it's sort of posing a puzzle and then sort of working backwards of finding the hidden rewards at play in the puzzle.
Yeah. A lot of the work in this domain is really about that. You and I live in the world, we live in our minds, and we often are not in the business of asking why our minds work the way that they do. And if the whole point of the book is to try to understand that, you kind of need to step out of your mind. There's an analogy here to Copernicus of, you look up into the sky and it looks like the sun is moving around the earth. And for many, many, many years, that's what people thought happened. But if you manage to change your perspective and kind of imagine yourself from a different perspective, suddenly things can be clearer. And so part of what's going on here is you have to step out of yourself and then see the patterns across a few different domains and start to think, okay, wait, that's an interesting set of patterns. Can we use is there an obvious explanation? No. Well, maybe game theory can help here. Okay, and then you kind of go from there.
Before we started, I was telling you about The Traitors, and if you haven't seen The Traitors, and this is going to seem like a complete tangent, I'm guessing you also haven't seen Real Housewives.
That one at least I know is a TV show. The Traitors I didn't even know.
So again, this is going to seem like a tangent, but there's a point. I love Real Housewives, and especially Real Housewives in New York. So much so that a few years ago, I even wrote an essay on strategy and the Real Housewives in New York. And basically, my argument was that all the women on Roni are competing for hegemony, and I was sort of defining hegemony as longevity, which was sort of staying on the show for as long as possible, prestige, and also reputation. And prestige and reputation help with building alliances against any other housewife that challenges you. And weirdly, as I was reading Hidden Games, I was like, oh, this also explains a lot of housewives interactions, because I was sort of thinking that longevity, staying on the show, you need to give good story. It needs to be compelling TV, and that can lead to seemingly irrational drama, because although it may seem strange that one housewife is causing an argument with another, it's also really good TV and helps with them staying on the show. On New York, prestige was important, and prestige was sort of the credibility of your endeavors, your skill in pursuing them. Like Carol Radziwill was one of the least wealthy housewives, but she had the highest prestige because she was a journalist. She was an author. She was connected to the Kennedys. So it had this like allure that she was then able to leverage against wealthier but less prestigious housewives. And then also reputation. If you could have a good argument on Roni, it would boost your reputation that you could sort of hold your own. Whereas on a show like Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, it will dampen your reputation if you have an open argument. It's much better if you keep things quiet, gossip secretly on the sidelines, but to expose undermines your reputation. And also in Beverly Hills, it doesn't so matter how you made your wealth, so long as you can, in a sense, costly signal that you have wealth, even if you don't really have it. That's as important as actually being rich. So yeah, as I was reading Hidden Games, it was just all these ways of that's weirdly like Real Housewives.
It's interesting, first of all, that the patterns you describe are so much like the stereotypes of the East Coast versus the West Coast, right? The East Coast has these hierarchies, these old money power structures, prestige structures that are associated with things like the media. Especially as somebody who lives in New England, like this is the Boston Brahmin, the home of the Boston Brahmins, and like all of that kind of stuff. And so that that is something people kind of talk about as a difference between the East Coast and the West Coast. The West Coast doesn't really have that as much. It's really like much more egalitarian in some sense and meritocratic, but at the same time, in a surface level, and just showing off your wealth is like just a big thing that happens. Everybody drives nicer cars on the West Coast. The way that your car, your house, and you look are a bigger deal. It's a little bit more in your face. There's a little bit less subtlety going on. Now, that's one stereotype that I noticed that you described. And the other one is you have on the West Coast a less confrontational culture. So I remember always having grown up outside of New York, finding it unnatural that on the West Coast you do small talk a lot. You talk a lot about things like the weather. What are you going to do this weekend? The weather. You don't, you don't walk into a party and just start talking about politics or like some sort of heavy topic. Whereas here in Boston, within 5 minutes you're done talking about the weather, which mind you is more interesting than the weather in California, right? Like California weather never change. I don't know what they're talking about, but Boston, at least the weather's moving around. In theory, you could talk about it, but instead, you're doing things like talking about current events and yeah, or some sort of like philosophical topic or something like that, and that kind of heavy conversation is expected and seen as a good thing. Whereas on the West Coast, you would be seen as a buzzkill, and you're perfectly capturing that stereotype. And it is really interesting. Like cultures vary wildly in terms of norms and what is acceptable conversation, how confrontational you can be, how much you should be signaling overtly versus not. I remember I visited Japan, and before visiting Japan, I read a book that was written in the 1980s for American businessmen on how to interact. And it was full of these kind of examples of how Americans are used to doing X in the workplace. And in Japan, this would go over really badly because the Japanese are used to Y. And so they were really like laying out the land. And I think somebody who does well on Good Housewives of New York might do very badly in Beverly Hill and vice versa because of things like this.
It's kind of why one of the reasons why Hidden Games so interested me that you and Moshe show the application of these things beyond, say, sort of dry academic subjects, but more sort of like everyday life situations.
Yeah, there was an effort there to use game theory to study the things that we live through every day. So, for instance, in Real Housewives, you mentioning the fact that people costly signal, you're using the game theory jargon, but really what you mean is like they buy fancy stuff. That if you look at it for a moment, you think, wait a minute, why are you spending money on this fancy stuff? It's not really better than the non-fancy stuff. So, for instance,
one of the most damaging accusations you can make in Real Housewives, outside of New York, is you bought a Christian Dior dress for the show and then returned it because you don't really have the money.
So you're faking it. You're taking advantage of the system to fake it, which makes you a hypocrite. It makes you even worse.
Yeah,
But you could ask, like, why are people even spending that money on the Christian Dior? Why do they like it in the first place? Why is that viewed as positive? And that's strange. Like the people. So for instance, people ride around in Lamborghinis. The Lamborghini stuck in traffic isn't going any faster than a 20-year-old Honda Fit, and yet people are willing to spend an extra few zeros on it. Why would you do that? And then it gets even more interesting when you start thinking about things beyond just signaling wealth, because you can look at all the sorts of other signals that pop up. They're clearly costly signals of something, but you have to think about what kind of carefully. So for instance, what does it mean when somebody's a wine snob? Well, they have money because they can buy fancy wine, but it's not just that. Like they're not sinking a bunch of champagne. They're sitting around talking about it endlessly they're spending hours and hours. They go to classes, they visit vineyards, things like that. Like they could just go to Club Med and sit on their, a nice chair for a while and enjoy that. And instead, they're devoting time and energy to this too. Clearly, there's something else going on there. Or I think about hipsters in Brooklyn or East London. Those guys aren't signaling money, but they're doing plenty of signaling. What are they signaling? They're probably signaling something that's more about their social network. So here's something that's similar to what the old money people on the East Coast of New York are doing, and so on and so forth. So sitting there and reverse engineering these signals that we kind of take for granted is part of what the book is about.
I felt seen at the wine example in the book, because I don't actually know that much about wine. But I want to be seen to know about wine. Therefore, I know in my head, if I go to a restaurant or I'm in a store, get the one that's priced in the middle. Because if you get the really cheap one, people will think you don't know what you're talking about. If you go for the really expensive one, they'll think you're showing off. But if you go for the one in the middle, people must think that you know that that's some sort of hidden secret in the wine world that you are attuned to. And I felt seen so in that discussion of wine, I was like, oh yeah, that's what I do.
I have a funny story with my grandfather. Probably about 25 years ago, my grandfather was visiting us. He was in Israel. We were in the United States already, and we went out for dinner. And my grandfather, who did know a little bit about wine, I wouldn't say he's an expert, but enough that he could order from a wine list comfortably, looks at the wine list and orders the cheapest wine on the menu. And after he gives the menu back and the waiter goes away, I asked him why he did that, because he had previously told me it's typically not a good idea to order the cheapest wine on the menu. So I knew the rule of thumb that you were using. And he says to me, the prices of the wine on this list are criminally inflated. And the cheapest wine they have is a very cheap bottle, but from a good manufacturer, and it will at least be tasty. and, and that's when I knew my grandfather actually knew something about wine and didn't give an F about what anybody thought.
Well, one thing I wrestled with reading Hidden Games was sort of like we're always like enmeshed in stuff. We have a wide range of like different aspirations, different interests. We're engaged in like dozens of games at any one time, it seems. And so reading the book, I was sort of grappling with how best should someone prioritize, or like what games would complement one another.
That is a very good question and a difficult one to answer. And I think that any single answer, there is not one answer for everybody to that question. The right way to answer that question is kind of in a tailored way for each individual. Some games people have no choice over. They don't really, we don't have control over things like our sense of rights or justice so much. They're kind of imposed on us by society. But some things you do have control over. So for instance, if you look at what principles someone decides to kind of adhere to, once you adhere to a principle, you don't really have a choice of turning it on and off. That makes you non-principled. But you do have a choice of whether that's something that you really want to pursue. You can adopt certain, say, a more liberal or a more conservative set of principles if we're talking about politics, or you can think beyond that. So for instance, in the tech world, some people care a lot about privacy. That's a set of principles they've adopted. It has nothing to do with political ideology, something else. Or, in the religious world, there's certain sets of principles that people might adopt as well, and they might really hew to them. And there's kind of a decision that's being made there. And there's a question of what kind of principles should I personally adopt. That kind of introspection is probably fairly productive. And I don't think that there's a single answer, but I do think that like understanding what the principle does, um, understanding what it could do for you, breaking that down and thinking through, like, is this something that could make me more successful in some way in the long run? It is productive, even if at first it's kind of Machiavellian and kind of strategic, but as long as later you stick with it no matter what, it actually makes you better in some way. So to give you a concrete example, let's take someone like Tim Cook, who is the CEO of Apple. Let's say 20 years ago, 30 years ago, before Apple is yet known for privacy, Tim Cook doesn't yet really have a set of principles around privacy. We know that today he actually does. We know that today he actually thinks like privacy is something that's like to be taken fairly seriously. We've seen Apple take actions that are costly to Apple that kind of back that up. They integrate privacy into the operating system more deeply than other companies do. They have refused law enforcement requests on many occasions, in a few cases, fairly high profile cases, like after the San Bernardino shooting. And you could ask, okay, Tim Cook today believes in a set of principles. What happened 20 years ago, 25 years ago that he decided to adopt a set of principles? And obviously I wasn't there, but my guess is that if to the extent that he even thought about it at all, and it didn't just kind of like happen naturally, probably what happened was he thought to himself, if I'm not going to really stick to my guns on this, people are not going to trust Apple. They already don't trust Google and Google can't really do this because of their business model, which has to do with advertising. Apple has a different business model. We sell hardware integrated with software. We might be able to do this and therefore kind of benefit from the added trust that we get as a contrast to Google building the Android operating system. And either he thought through this and then was like, okay, now we're going to stick it out, or he didn't think through it and it kind of like was reinforced. And over time, people actually gave him some kudos for it. And so, it was reinforced that way. I'm not sure which happened, but my guess is that is how he ended up being into privacy. And I think that we can do something similar. We have some control over which principles we adopt and lean into, and that can change who trusts us for what. And thinking through that, and then later being like, okay, and now I'm going to be completely principled about this and stick to it no matter what, can benefit us. So that's one piece of guidance I can give, but it depends. Like some other environments, the game gets thrown at you, and you just have to see what happens.
So as I was like getting ready for this interview today, sort of a real world example as opposed to a reality TV show example of because hidden games in operation is Donald Trump and tariffs, and I was sort of thinking how on the face of it the tariffs seem irrational, like they undermine very profitable, successful relationships with Canada and Mexico. They create distrust. They threaten to worsen the economic conditions that led to his victory. But then as I was reading everything through, I was like, oh, that relates to Hawk Dove, or arguably it's costly signaling, because if the US can absorb the costs that come from tariffs, then other people might be suitably impressed by the self-harm and just concede to any future demands to avoid similar fate for themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable supposition. It's a little hard to know with Trump. He likes to claim he's a very good negotiator. We haven't seen a ton of good evidence for that, honestly. I mean, he has this like image as a savvy businessman, but in fact, he has no real history to back it up, and an inquiry into his success in terms of negotiation in business and politics comes up fairly empty. Um, One possibility is this is indeed a negotiating tactic, and negotiating tactics do work better when they are credible. And the United States, as you say, can absorb more than most negotiating partners, and so basically saying we have a willingness to absorb pain in order to get favorable conditions can be credible. We have an entire chapter, the second to last chapter, that's on credible threats of this kind and how they've shaped our psychology. So that is possible, and a lot of people are sort of interpreting his actions in this way. Another possibility with Trump is that he actually just thinks tariffs are good for a country. Most economists don't think so, so he's kind of at odds. Although most economists, the way they analyze tariffs is very different from the way the typical person might. So they might be missing key aspects that a typical person might think is good. And there is a reasonable debate as to whether economists have kind of gotten all the right parts of the analysis. I've included all the right things in the analysis. And so he has talked about tariffs and written about tariffs pretty consistently for a long time. So there's some things that Trump says that is just like very clearly he's saying whatever is suitable for the moment. And then there's some things that he said that have been very consistent, and tariffs is one of the latter. And so it seems in this case like actually maybe this isn't a negotiating tactic at all, and he's just going to impose tariffs because he really believes that they are going to be better for America or better for the part of America he cares about, or something like that. We'll see. My guess is as good as anyone else's.
Well, I mean, I was sort of thinking that it's like, as you said, his approach to negotiation, it's always hawk, it's always confrontational. It's always the most aggressive stance, but there's never any recognition of like something can be positive sum. The approach is always zero sum, and so I was also, when I was reading the coverage and the analysis, I was also like, this could also just be a reputation thing of like, he may think people like him to be confrontational, therefore he will always be confrontational because it boosts his reputation with his own base. And so that was something I was like sort of thinking of.
I agree with that. It seems like Trump is always trying to win, even in situations where actually there's not a contest. Like that's not the point of this. And yet he somehow has like built in for him is some sort of contest. And it seems to me like his game has always been about like ratings and staying in the news cycle. It kind of reminded me a little bit of how you're describing the Real Housewives of New York. His incentives seem kind of aligned with theirs.
Well, again, a weird dovetail. One of the housewives, Ramona Singer, one of the Real Housewives of New York, there's a video of her dancing at Mar-a-Lago just after January 6th. So they're all connected.
Wow. Yeah. So I mean, he does seem to be playing. He's marching to a different tune. He has different set of rules that kind of. First of all, he grew up in a different world. He grew up in the New York elite, but he also seems to have made a living by breaking norms in a way that other people haven't, and seems to benefit from it. And so, like, it's a little hard to apply the normal analysis. Okay, this is a game where there's mutual benefits. Normally, it would be, but for Trump, there's only one person that can come out on top, because that's how all games work for him, and so he's going to play it kind of differently than everybody else. He's ignoring certain fundamentals and looking at the game for himself personally, which looks different.
I mean, the reason why I was thinking about it is that the line that you and Moshe use about figuring out the hidden rewards and then working backwards in terms of steps. So I was sort of thinking, what could Canada and Mexico do as a way to counter that game, was what I was sort of like, does it benefit them first, or almost like a costly cooperation kind of thing, if they can coordinate a response and tolerate the tariffs, and to such a point where it imposes a cost on the United States, to the point where some sort of negotiation can happen where there's a win-win kind of thing, or does the hawk dove dynamic come into it, or
Yeah, it's a tough situation because you could imagine that if they tried to escalate in certain ways, that would actually, there's the old adage, two dogs will fight until a wolf arrives. But when the wolf arrives, they unite. And I can imagine that what happens in the United States is that a bunch of people who are anti-tariffs initially suddenly become pro-tariffs because they want to, to project American strength and be pro-American. Um, and so you don't want to escalate the negotiation in a way that enables that dynamic. Instead, you need to escalate the negotiation in a way that kind of undermines support for tariffs in the United States. So that's one thing that I think is important for them as they're thinking through how to respond. The other one is the one that you're highlighting, which is the issue of credibility. Like they need to choose things where they're threats. When the U.S. looks at those threats, they're like, oh, they can actually follow through, because otherwise the U.S. will just look at that and be like, oh, they're not actually going to do that, which is actually a problem with Trump, is that he's often issuing threats, but they're not, they haven't been thought through always. But he gets called on them, and they don't want to get called on their threats. And so we'll see how they manage that part, because it is difficult if your GDP is lower and your military is not as strong and so on. What threats do you have that you can follow through on? The concept in game theory is called subgame perfection, which sounds like total jargon. Like, what does that have to do with credibility? But the reason it's called that is because what credibility is about, this sense of credibility, is about what happens if you actually are called on your bluff. The whole point of a bluff is it's not supposed to happen. You're not supposed to get to that part of the game. But if you do, you get called on it and you have to behave optimally. So a sub-game perfect um, uh, strategy is one that, or a sub-game perfect equilibrium in a set of strategies in which people are playing sub-game perfectly, is one in which everybody is playing optimally in all sub-games, even ones you're not supposed to arrive at. I.e., even if you call a bluff, the person will actually go ahead and play according to the strategy. So the strategy has to be such that that their threat is credible.
so like at time of recording, my guest this week is behavioral scientist Nick Chater, and he wrote a book a few years ago called "The Mind Is Flat." Basically, his argument is that there's no subconscious, there's no hidden thoughts. The way that the brain works, it's just all sensory experience, memories of past experiences built up over time, and sort of imagination in making sense of them all. And out of that comes improvised stories or metaphors or cliches. So it was weird both preparing for this interview and also preparing for his interview, because to some extent it was like yours and his books were contrasting. So his argument is kind of the brain works outside in. Like, we have sensory experiences of the world, we combine them with past experiences, and then we come up with a story to make sense of them. And my feeling in Hidden Games was yours and Moshe's approach is more inside out. There's almost a subconscious strategist who assesses external events according to its knowledge of game theory. So on the one hand, I was thinking it's quite contrasting, but then I also thought it's also complementary, because you can experience things, events, senses that roughly sum up to a story that aligns with game theory, and you reach for it to explain a current situation that you're in.
There is a meaningful debate that he's wading into about how exactly the mind works, that in many ways we are trying almost to avoid, in that it would be bad if hidden games only worked if the particular psychological process is one way versus another. It would make it too sensitive to something that is, I think, scientifically not yet understood so well. And why don't we introduce some jargon which we use in the book? There's a contrast between the proximate psychology, the thing that you're actually thinking, the thoughts that you have in your head, and that you have access to, and the ultimate level explanation for that psychology, which is the hidden game that is going on that we're trying to assess. And I don't think that hidden games is so sensitive to whether there literally is somebody in a subconscious, a subconscious strategist. Like, in fact, what could happen is that you just like develop certain intuitions, and these happen based on past experience, as Nick is describing, and then you get a stimulus and you respond based on how that intuition has developed. And so we're actually fairly consistent with that worldview as well. What really matters to us is the degree to which people over time learn intuitions that work on average, that are optimal in some sense. They don't have to be optimal literally every single time, but optimal in the sense that like learning has honed them so that they on average are benefiting you. And as long as that's the case, then then using game theory is legitimate in order to create an ultimate explanation. But we don't really need to wade into the discussion of whether or not there is actually a subconscious or isn't a subconscious or something like that. What you need is optimization, and you don't need a subconscious for optimization. Now, you can have one. And in some contexts, people have, I think, convincingly argued that there is one. But for us, it's not so important. It's more about like, arguing as if there's a subconscious. And often we will talk as if there's somebody in there, in the brain pulling the levers in some sort of optimal way. But we don't actually literally mean that. Another distinction we talk about in the book that's useful for this is the distinction between emic and eidic. So the kind of arguments that we will often give and come up with that Nick is describing, we call those emic arguments. It's a phrase we borrowed from anthropologists. And the anthropologist who comes from an external culture and is trying to understand why would people give these emic explanations. Oh, well, that kind of explanation is an eidic explanation. And so again, that we can think of these as analogous to proximate versus ultimate. We want to be able to give an eidic explanation, but we don't necessarily need for the emic ones to work in any particular way in order to do that.
What are the main things you'd like people to take away from hidden games?
I would say actually the lesson we were just discussing is one of the major ones. So this idea that there are different ways that we can be trying to provide an explanation. And really, it's really useful to think about these more eidic explanations or more ultimate level explanations, these hidden games that are operating at that level that we don't necessarily have access to. I would say that's a first order lesson of the book. And really all the book is about is providing 10 examples for that. And hoping that you walk away being like, okay, like maybe I didn't agree with all of these examples and some of them didn't make that much sense to me, but as long as there's enough of them for people to think, okay, that approach is useful.
Erez, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I want to thank Erez again for sparing the time. If you enjoyed our conversation, please like, rate, and comment on whichever platform you're listening on. If you'd like to buy hidden games and signal that you support independent stores in the UK, then visit the Strategy Aaron bookshop page. The link is in the show notes. Strategy Aaron now has a YouTube page. It would be great if you go and subscribe. Not only are there old episodes of the show, but I'm also going to be doing other content for it, like Ask Aaron. So, as well as subscribing, it'd be great if you could send me any questions you have about strategy, world affairs, whatever, and that'd be great. So the link is also in the show notes. Hope you all tune in again next week.